Speak with Daw KC, barrister, writer and broadcaster. Afternoon to you, Chris. I mean, we talk a lot, you and I, about prisons and the authenticity or the use of prisons. This fellow was sentenced to, a few years initially, back in the 70s. He's ended up doing half a century on the inside, but mostly for crimes committed while he was in there rather than before he went there.
Yeah, I think if anyone's thinking of having a gamble on the outcome of this case, I wouldn't recommend you bet on him being released anytime soon. I've been reading some of the things that he's been saying. One of them was that he went through I went through a phase, he said, about hostage taking. I just couldn't help taking hostages. He said there's nothing better than wrapping a governor up like a Christmas turkey. Now, I think if you say that in your parole hearing, I think probably you're going to struggle.
You don't tend to enamour yourself with the head honchos of the parole board with comments like that. But I guess, that when one of the prison staff had said that he probably can't cope, and this was somebody who's been very close to him, I mean, that's a different argument, right? I mean, that's not about whether he's going to reoffend. That's whether or not somebody who's been institutionalised for 5 decades could ever find themselves going about their everyday business in a flat somewhere without at some point losing the plot maybe, and who knows, getting themselves in bother or harming themselves or just not being able to do what most people take for granted on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, that's part and parcel of the officer's job, to make that sort of assessment, and it's part of the evidence that the parole board has to consider. Is this person actually, do they have the skills to actually exist in the outside world? And as we know, Charles Bronson has spent many decades in solitary confinement, and we're told that he hardly has any contact with other people, doesn't have any real kind of socialization skills of any kind. And clearly it seems to me that when the parole board look at these cases, they're applying the same test, whether it's Charles Bronson or anyone else serving a life sentence, and that's, does this person remain a danger to the public? And I have to say, and I think it's fantastic that finally some of these hearings are taking place in public. I think the only problem for me is, why isn't it being streamed live so that we can all watch? I mean, it's clear we're learning so much more about the way the parole process works. We're learning about how the evidence is taken by the parole board, the sorts of questions they ask, and the opportunity given to the prisoner to state their case and make their argument as to why they're safe to be released. I think it's fantastic, this transparency. It's really good that we're able to see this level of detail, because I suspect many of these parole cases, people think that the parole board got it wrong because they don't necessarily understand exactly the process and they don't know what the parole board were told. In this case, I would, put way more than £1 on the fact that he won't be released. And people, I hope, will appreciate that the reason for that is because it's crystal clear, to me at least, that seeing the evidence that I've seen so far in his history, that he clearly is not safe to be released. And I very strongly suspect that will be the decision. But I think it's much better that we all know why, rather than it all being a mystery.
So do you think then, Chris, that just to clarify, that the fact that he probably isn't safe to be released is because he just wouldn't be able to cope with life, or that he might reoffend?
No, I mean, the principal issue is he a danger to the public? And that's the decisive factor. You don't keep people in prison purely because they lack life skills, for example, because the answer to that issue is that people will live in a hostile environment, and that might be a condition of their parole. All sorts of other sort of things can be put in place, provided someone isn't dangerous to other people, or, you're right to point out, a danger to themselves, which is sometimes the case for people who are applying for parole. But the key issue here is public safety. The parole board are duty-bound to consider public safety first and foremost, and in this case, the evidence seems to me to be all one way.
Yeah, you just, from what we know about his time on the inside, and being a very naughty boy when he's been there, particularly when decisions don't go his way, the idea of this man being in a kind of hostel of some sort, or having that first moment in a post office queue, whatever it happens to be, you can kind of. So even if he wouldn't have done this before he went to jail, but certainly now it seems that, after 50 years on the inside, this is somebody who loses the plot very easily.
Yeah, I mean, he's taken, we're told in the evidence, he was first sent to jail in 1968. He's held a total of 11 hostages in 9 different sieges. He's taken governors, doctors, staff, and even his own solicitor hostage on one occasion. And plainly, this is someone who does and has over the years represented a real danger to others. There is a bigger question, and I hesitate to sort of bring it up after all this time, but you know, what did the prison system do in 1968 when he first went in there? Because if you can't really think of a better example of the failure of our prison system, when after 50 years in prison, he really doesn't sound like he's that much different to the way he must have been on day one. And if that doesn't tell you that prison doesn't work, which is, of course, the main theme of many of our discussions and many of the things that I've written about and broadcast about on this topic, then really nothing will. Prison doesn't work, and he's a prime example of how it doesn't work.
I'm always fascinated, and you as a lawyer, Chris, you've met some, you know, I know that you are a very respected defence lawyer, but even with your defence hat on, you'd acknowledge you've met some horrible characters over the years, and, you know, it goes with the territory, I suppose. And I guess on a slightly separate note, but it seems very relevant to this guy, Mr. Bronson, that what is that thing where someone has the choice in life? You can do the right thing if you go that way, and you can do the wrong thing if you go that way. And if you do the right thing, everything that will happen subsequently will be much better for you, it'll be much easier for you, and you will be a better person as a result. Or you could go the bad way, in which case what's coming your way will be hardship and more angst and grief and jip and hassle. And yet, a percentage of people, and he sounds like the kind of person that's done this time and time again, they opt for the hard way. Well, what do you make of that? I know you're a lawyer, not a psychologist, but your own experience in dealing with bad people, you must have pondered that question as well.
Well, it's very interesting that you say dealing with bad people, because there's a chapter in my book which is about the fact that I don't really consider people to be bad or good. I think people do bad things. And the reason why most of my clients who have been involved in serious violence or even murder over the last 30 years became criminalised in the first place was generally a combination of extreme circumstance. So often children who were themselves the victims of violence, abuse, witnessing serious and horrific incidents in their early childhood, so that their kind of way of thinking and their perception of the world was completely altered from that of the average person who thankfully faces a rather more pleasant childhood and doesn't necessarily find themselves exposed to seeing one of their parents murdered or being beaten every day by a parent on drugs or drink or being abandoned into the care system, which is one of the greatest triggers for involvement in the criminal justice system. As I told you before, if you've been in care, you're 15 times more likely to go to prison in later life. And that's not because people in children and young people in care are 15 times more criminogenic or criminalised. It's because the care system is a total failure in looking after young people and keeping them safe and keeping us safe from some of the things that they do. So there's a whole range of reasons why people commit crimes. But the one thing I'm certain is it's not because people are somehow born inherently evil. It's because of things that happen to them. And yes, propensities, which other people also have and manage to control. There are propensities towards violence, etc. But most of the people I've met over my career have been people whose lives have been so horrific that it would be unimaginable to you or I to have lived the way that they did from their early childhood.
Chris, thank you, as ever. He is Chris Daw KC, barrister, writer and broadcaster, initially there with reference to Charles Bronson.